Hi there, this is Inyash with two quick notes before we begin. The first is an apology. Very soon after we set up, my microphone got knocked out and we didn't notice. I was still picked up on a nearby microphone, and we boosted my voice on that everywhere we could. However, for the entire podcast, I sound distant and echoey, and it's kinda hard to hear me. I apologize about that, and we'll be better about checking our mics in the future. The second thing is that before we started recording, those of us on this episode just kinda bullshitted for 10 minutes. It's not really relevant to the podcast, but for any of our Patreon subscribers, we've thrown up about 10 minutes of our miscellaneous chatter and humor. Just as a little extra behind the scenes for anyone who wants it. Thanks, and now on to the episode.
Welcome to the Bayesian Conspiracy. I'm Inyash Brodsky.
I'm Steven Zuber, and we have two guests this episode.
Hi, I'm Sean.
Hi, I'm Matthew.
Returning from punching Nazis.
Yes. There is a podcast project that has recently come out to make all the sequences available in audio format as a podcast. We've talked about the sequences a lot. They were the original posts written by Eliezer at lesswrong.com. Actually started out at overcomingbias.com, which kind of kickstarted the whole rationality subculture back in 2007, I think. Anyways, they're a starting point. They really explained the rationality much better than I could, and I said in, I think, our very first episode that if you really want this rationality thing explained, your very best resource by far is just to go and read those sequences of posts. Eliezer went ahead and compiled them into a book because a lot of people were like, hey, we hate surfing posts on the internet. Is there like a book that we can have? And no, you can't have a bound book because that is really, really big and you'd have to pay an obscene amount of money to get something that big bound in a single tome. But it is available as an ebook. And now there is two guys from Europe who are recording every single chapter. Each chapter is one post. It is between 5 and 15 episodes per chapter and putting them out as a podcast.
So two things. One, the book wasn't compiled by Eliezer, it's compiled by somebody else, I think with permissions and thumbs up or whatever. But there is a podcast out there that I think you have to pay for. I bought a couple of the subsequences. I bought A Human's Guide to Words and Reductionism.
They appear to now be defunct.
The Castify ones?
Yeah.
Yeah, I looked for them, 6 months ago and couldn't find them again, so someone's doing them for free, it sounds like.
Yes.
I didn't know you could make a podcast mandatory paying.
Well, I mean, you can, it's not a podcast, it's audio files, and to download them, you pay money.
So, how would an audiobook version of the sequences work, since all the posts I've read have, 19 links to other sequences?
I'm assuming you just don't get the links.
And Rationality from AI to Zombies is in a bit more order than the sequences on lesswrong.com, so there's less of a need to, link to previous things. I think the links are still there in the book if you buy it, but it's much more in order, so a little more accessible. That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
And what's the name of their podcast?
I believe it's Rationality AI to Zombies, the podcast.
Hey, there it is.
Yeah.
Rationality from AI to Zombies, the podcast. Subscribe. Are you shitting me? Sorry.
Done.
Subscribe.
The reason I bring that up is because at our last Less Wrong meetup, which we have in Denver once a month, I got to talking with Matthew about the Torture versus Dust Specks post. And we'd been kind of drinking, and we were like, hey, why weren't we recording this? This was awesome. We should totally put it up on for the podcast. And so now we're doing that.
All right, so Matt, do you want to lay out the Dust Speck versus Torture thought experiment as best you can?
So Yudkowsky, I'm not sure how, but he did come to the conclusion that the least bad thing that can happen, something with a negative utility, but the smallest possible negative utility that's measurable, would be having a dust speck end up in your eye. Part of the hypothesis is that's all that happens. There are no side effects. It's not that a dust speck hits you in the eye while you're flying a plane and then you crash the plane. Ignore that. It's just purely dust speck, and that's it.
And if you have calluses on your eye or something and getting a dust speck in your eye doesn't hurt you, then substitute something that actually does hurt a bit, like stubbing your toe or getting a paper cut or something.
Right.
Those strike me as orders of magnitude higher than dust specks.
Certainly magnitudes.
It's kind of this abstract idea of a really minor inconvenience, the most minor inconvenience that you'll acknowledge as a thing.
The least bad thing.
But it'll go away in 3 seconds, right?
Yes, a very minor pain. I don't think it can be just inconvenience. It has to be some measure of pain.
I thought it was just some measure of negative etalons. We should have been
Right.
more articulate on this.
Etalons. So I should probably mention that I haven't read almost any of the less wrong stuff.
You're fine.
Etalons, I don't. Is that a unit of measurement of utility or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Positive and negative.
All right. So I get kind of the idea. It's just like a term for measuring utility. Positive or negative is basically what you were saying.
Yeah, if depending on how into consequentialism and utilitarianism you want to get, you can start quantifying it with units called utils or utilons. But I mean, for the most part, you're talking about happiness and suffering, or pleasure and pain, or something like that, right?
Sure.
So,
And I assume there has to be some measure of pain involved because that's what negative utility is, right?
or
we
unpleasantness.
experience-
I mean, it can be pain if your definition of pain is broad enough to include things that aren't literally pain.
Do wet socks hurt?
So an uncomfortable thought.
Right.
So like what, or what, like an uncomfortable thought, or like a small emotional trauma, or like
Something whose net
trauma's
value
probably
is
too extreme a
negative.
word.
The
but-
thing is, I hate wet socks a lot.
Same. So that's why I wanted to. I wanted to pick
Definitely
out.
worse than stubbing my
I wanted
toe.
to pick out an example that was obviously not painful, but obviously negative utility.
Okay.
Because I'd rather get 100 dust specks to the face than get my socks wet. So
So, if the least bad thing is having a death spec float into your eye and give you the tiniest bit of measurable minor inconvenience, then it would be better for one person to be tortured for 50 years and 3 to the third to the third to the third, or a Googleplex, or whatever conveniently large number fits, not have dust specks flying to their eye.
Let's really quickly unpack the number. I think the actual number doesn't matter that much, but the point is the number is so large that if you were to take the number of all the atoms in the universe that we can measure, took that to the power of itself, that number still wouldn't even approach how many people we're talking about at this point. It is an unimaginably large number.
so nearly infinite.
Nearly infinite. The only reason I don't use infinite is because infinite seems like such a vacuous concept that to me it almost feels like nothing. Whereas when I think of the number of atoms that exist and then multiply that by itself, that's an actual like large number that infinity. I know technically infinity is more, but infinity doesn't feel like more. Infinity sounds like, your stupid infinity plus one.
Douglas Adams has a good thing about infinity in Hitchhiker's Guide, where Arthur, is that the main character?
Dude, I don't know.
Whoever he is.
Yeah, it's Arthur Dent.
He's in space and he's in front of a very large object, and he looks to his left and he sees the object go on for infinity. Oh wait, no, it isn't infinity, because he can see it curve ever so slightly, which has a more imposing effect than if it didn't curve, because humans can't handle infinity.
Right. So he can actually see it. Like he can actually understand. Like this thing is really really big, whereas infinite would be incomprehensible, basically.
That many people getting a little bit of negative utility.
If the measurement for a dust speck is 0.000000001, and you multiply that by a impressively huge number, then the amount of utilons, whatever 50 years of torture happens to be, would be less than that number caused by dust specks.
I don't think we laid out that it's being weighed against 50 years of torture for one individual until just now. So like that's the important crux of the position, that it's this dust speck into basically infinite number of eyeballs versus one person being tortured for 50 years. And the idea is that, well, because you're taking an infinitesimal thing times the opposite of an infinitesimal thing, and then you just have one, being suffering as much as possible for 5 decades, the dust specks add up to more negative utilons than one person being tortured.
And on the surface, that does sound kind of ridiculous, as I'm sure most people are now thinking, because we have such an aversion to thinking of someone being tortured even for 5 minutes. But, as you pointed out, this started as something that seems entirely reasonable and then is taken to an extreme, yes?
Yes.
Would you like to recapitulate that argument? Because I thought that was fascinating the way you laid it out.
Should we all kind of say like where we are on that whole thing?
Yeah, sure. Where are you on that whole thing?
Totes against.
Yeah, not only is it everyone should get a speck of dust in their eye. I think it's a slam dunk, and like why would you even like? Sure, we should think of everything, but in the scenario in which this like almost unfathomably large number of people get a speck of dust in their eye, nobody's tortured. It's just a bunch of people who get this momentary like speck of dust in their eye for like 3 seconds, and then or for 1 second or split second or whatever it is, and then like 5 seconds later, all those people are fine, and nobody gets tortured. That seems like a very obvious. That's better than someone getting tortured for 50 years.
And Yudkowsky's point is that feels obvious because our stupid ape brain has a problem with scale.
So the problem with scale works to make this just a problem that we should know that we can't intuitively address, right? It can't be, well, intuitively, I would think that torture is the worst, so I'm going to just go with that. The correct answer isn't to go for the other solution because you know that your intuitive answer is wrong. You should look at the other answer and say, well, I can't really intuit that answer either, so I don't feel like my intuition is a good guide to this problem. That doesn't mean that you can't solve it, but that doesn't mean that I think you can't intuitively solve it.
When I first read the post, I was very much against the conclusion as well, and my reasoning was that I would volunteer to take a duck speck in the eye if it meant that someone wouldn't get tortured for 50 years. And I imagine that every person who is worth having around on the planet with me, or even in the same universe as me, would also make that trade. It doesn't matter how many of them there are. If everyone would be willing to make that trade, then obviously it would be better to have that happen than to have the 50 years of torture.
First of all, I don't think Yudkowsky picks a side. I think he just says the answer is obvious.
He absolutely does.
He does.
Yes.
In the post, he only says the answer is obvious, but he does pick
In
a
a comment, he
there's
says...
a discussion, yeah.
Down the line, yeah.
A
but
thing,
at the
yeah.
beginning, to make it kind of thought-provoking post thing, he just lays out the conundrum and then said the answer is obvious, right?
Yeah.
And I thought that was a fun way to get the discussion going, and it has some of the most comments on a lot of these.
Yes.
So
the way this sort of thing starts out, and I don't remember if this was the exact... I'm pretty sure this was not the exact example used in the post, but it would be something along the lines of, is it better for one person to have both their legs broken, or for 10 people...
Okay, so this is like a reduction of that big all-encompassing thing, and with a near infinite people and one person being tortured. It's just condensing it down to like a really small example.
Yeah, a good way to break it down...
so one person having both their legs broken, and then...
Or 10 people having one leg broken.
Right, so you're supposed to say the one person having both their legs broken because that's 2 legs versus 10 legs, right?
Exactly.
Okay,
and if you keep drawing that out, is it better for one person to have every bone in their body broken, or for everyone on the planet to have their wrist shattered?
Well, okay, right. So obviously you're supposed to choose the former.
Mm-hmm. Would you, though?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, if it's everyone in the world, that's 6 billion people currently, or more than that.
I think it's like 7 billion now.
It's 7 billion,
Is it
right?
6 billion?
we're closing in on 7.
Closing in on 7.
Okay, we're closing it. So 7 billion people get their wrists broken, versus one person having every bone in their body broken.
Yes, including those really tiny ones inside your inner ear.
Right. So that would cause a lot of problems, like for the world at large, if that were to happen.
Let's assume no knock-on effects.
That's what I was going to say, is that, like, imagine
That
suddenly everyone on
their
Earth
other
is...
hand for whatever is really important.
Okay, so there's nothing. So nothing.
We're still going to be able to go to work.
So it's better to break it down starting out further than breaking one leg versus 2 legs, where you say, should one person break one leg, or should 100 people stub their pinky toe in a minor enough way that they don't break the bone? They kick the table and they go, ow, and then
And they forget about it
hurts
10
them
seconds later.
for like 10 seconds or 10 minutes even.
Well, in
And-
that case, I think I would rather
Stub
go
the
with
toe.
the toe. Yeah.
Stub the toe, absolutely.
Right.
Because I think the one leg is more than the stubbing the toe.
Right, and as you expand that to, okay, what if 1 million people stubbed their toe versus one person breaking their arm?
Yep, stub toe.
What if it's 10 million people?
Stub toe.
Is there any level where you would not go with stub toe? I mean, if it was the entire population of the Earth and we had colonized the solar system,
Well,
so there was
right,
like
but I don't know,
100
it's-
billion people.
I see where you're going with this, like this continuous extrapolation of the problem and expanding it, but it's like when you get to a point where it's a speck of dust in your eye for like 2 seconds and you forget about it forever. For everybody versus someone being tortured for 50 years, that to me is an insane comparison. Like there's this underlying assumption that like all of suffering is on a single spectrum, right? So we take the furthest point over here and the furthest point over here, right? But it just seems like a really naive view of like utilitarian ethics in general to say that like, oh yeah, of course we should torture someone for 50 years because math. Like that just seems like a really...
Well, that is kind of
That's
the
my
whole
biggest
point.
problem with it. It's like, but no, like, you pick the dust specks because then nobody gets tortured for 50 years. That's insane.
So to give the argument that convinces me to steelman it against the thing that I'm agreeing with, would I say I prefer to torture one person for 50 years or break both legs of 1 million people? Not torturously, just their legs suddenly break and they get anesthetic, but their legs are broken.
So that to me is how to make this problem interesting. I didn't find the dust specks original thought experiment too torturous to me.
The dust
pun
specks
intended.
is largely part of the problem.
So that was it for me. Was that to me it's so small as to be equal to nothing, and so especially if you forget about it 3 seconds
Right.
later.
So think of the next.
No, I know that to me is that's when it becomes interesting. So if the original proposition is too weak and easy to dismiss, you've got to scale up the suffering to something that's not 0.0,
Right.
0.000.
It was supposed to be something that is on the same continuum, just the smallest possible you can get on that continuum.
So, but for me, the key thing is that you forget about it almost immediately with no like intervention to forget about it. And so, like, if that's the case, it might as well have never happened. Like even a stubbed toe is kind of on the order where I probably stubbed my toes 100 times in the last 10 years, but I don't remember any single time. To me, the idea that it's easily forgettable, and maybe the time frame has something to do there, part of this kind of gets shaky. You scale it up to, all right, fine, a broken bone versus torture. And like that, then you kind at least if that's how high you have to go. For me, I think you could draw it lower, but if you put it at almost literally nothing, that to me is exactly literally nothing. The dust speck, right?
So the two main issues with the argument that I'm thinking three of us have is, one, dust speck is just negligible.
Yeah,
It's supposed to be really close to zero, but to us it feels intuitively as if it were zero.
Yeah, I mean, I would pick dust specks over torturing someone for 1 year, or like 6 months, or 3 months, or 1 month, or like way less time, like any amount of time.
5 minutes
5 minutes. Yep. Nope. Dust
versus
specks.
every being in the universe getting a dust speck.
Yep. Nope. Dust specks.
Well, not just every being in the universe, a being for every atom in the universe, and then every one of those atoms having an equal amount of beings in them. And if you're not willing to go with dust speck, then go with, paper cut.
Make the problem fun. Yeah.
Right, but I do have a problem with Yudkowsky's attachment to the dust specks. He never suggests, well, if you have a problem with dust specks, go to the next
No, he
tiniest
does.
thing. When?
I mean, not in the post
Okay.
itself, because he wrote the post and then he put it out there, but later on in the comments, he
All right.
said, go ahead, go with stub toe if that's your lowest.
Right.
That's still painful.
The second problem we probably have intuitively, and I'd argue rationally, is whether or not something of a certain magnitude can equal any number of that thing. And his large argument his point is that eudolons reduce to a metric, and that's the metric. And it doesn't matter whether or not it happens an infinite amount of times, it's still a standard metric and they can be compared. So something 1,000 times worse happening once versus the other thing happening 1,000 times are perfectly equivalent. That is the root of his argument, I believe.
I don't know that I can get behind that one.
And I can't.
I really because
I disagree with it as well.
It just seems like the thing that's 1,000 times worse than the really minor thing, in some cases at the very least, is so many orders of magnitude worse that it just seems like a slam dunk where it's like
It's literally 3 orders of magnitude worse if it's 1,000 times worse.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah, but I think
Sure.
if you find something that's actually 1,000 times worse, then you would agree that 1/1000th of that is the same when multiplied over 1,000. Because when I think of like a paper cut versus breaking an arm, they don't seem like they are comparable, but that's because like I'm not saying like a paper cut is 1 and breaking an arm is 1 million. It would be more like a paper cut is 1 and breaking an arm is like 27 quadrillion. And at that point, once I've gotten 27 quadrillion paper cuts, I may prefer to have a broken arm rather than 27 quadrillion paper cuts.
Is there enough space on your body to have that many paper cuts? Because
He's immortal, and it
over
takes
50
10
years.
seconds to heal. Yeah.
Oh, nice. So he's Wolverine. Okay.
It's just that you're not using the right numbers. You're comparing something that is not 1/1000th to the 1,000.
And then you imagine actually, like you said, actually doing the math to some extent, whether you do it on paper or do it in your head, just, trying to make it equivalent. Say, yeah, I can get a paper cut. I can get 100 paper cuts on my body every second for the next 20 years, or I can break my arm. Well, I'm going to break my arm in a heartbeat. That sounds awful, right? Mm-hmm. So then you scale it. So like that does kind of drive that point home that there is a trade-off somewhere, right?
Well, right. But
I'd also take...
Yeah, are we drawing arbitrary lines or not?
Yeah, I think we probably are, because none of us have a pad and paper, and I don't think anyone's going to do complicated mental math in our head, but I might take the pain, but not like the physical manifestations and consequences of being set on fire for 3 seconds rather than break my arm, right?
So
like,
if you...
I'm not sure, but those are the kinds of things that you can weigh as far as how bad they would be, and you can actually just you just pick things back and forth and say, well, we'll weigh these against each other, right?
So you're talking about like when you say breaking your arm, is it like you have to get medical care? Your arm is inoperable for a certain amount of time, all that stuff that comes with it breaking your arm, or you just feel the pain of it breaking your arm and it doesn't have any lasting effects after that?
Either one. I mean, I was picturing actually breaking my arm doing 8 weeks in a cast and that sort of thing, but like with the fire one, I just said, just imagine being in super pain for a second, right?
Yeah.
3 seconds of the Crucio curse from Harry Potter. You know, I would choose that over the paper cuts, you know, I'd choose that over 10 paper cuts a day for the next year, right? Like, just because that would be super annoying and that'd be a constant drag. You know, I think I'd get over 5 seconds of the cruciitis, right? Maybe, depending on how bad it is. They didn't do a great job of painting it as the
rip the
literal
Band-Aid
worst.
off and just have that burst of pain just for 3 seconds kind of thing.
Sure.
I just want to point out that I slowly pull off Band-Aids.
I've heard that slowly pulling off Band-Aids is actually the better way to do it.
I'm sure it is.
I go about medium.
There was an actual pain study done, and I mean, pain is always kind of subjective. You got to ask people 1 to 10 and all that. But they found that in general, yanking the Band-Aid off first is quite a bit worse than slowly pulling it off, even though the little light pain is stretched out.
Are you saying because it causes some sort of trauma to your top layer of skin?
No, well, maybe, I don't know, but it was more painful than having that small amount of pain stretched out. And the reason the conjecture was the reason that nurses and parents and stuff always tell you to yank it off fast is because the person who's doing the yanking gets to feel pain as they're yanking as well. They either watch you squirm while they're slowly yanking it off and they feel really bad, or they yank it off once real quick and you flinch and they're like, okay, it's over, it's done.
Interesting.
So it's the person who is yanking it off gets a benefit from yanking it off quickly because they don't feel as much pain during the process.
There's a similar point to be made. There was a study done with getting patients to return for colonoscopies. If you prolong the procedure at its least uncomfortable point, you got, I forget the numbers, but these are in Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, I think.
I heard this too.
Yeah. So you get more people to come back if you prolong the procedure while it's at its least uncomfortable, like while it's there, but like not at the most painful part. Because in that way, they'll look. So there's the other possibility that explains it instead of like the slow rip off versus the hard rip off. If you do it a hard rip off and you look back and like, ow, that really hurt. If you do it slowly, it just sort of hurts. And so when you look back, you're like, well, yeah, I mean, it was a little uncomfortable, even though it might have aggregated to more or the similar amount of pain. With the colonoscopy thing, the idea is that you look back and you remember, oh yeah, it wasn't that bad, despite it having...
The time was just uncomfortable as opposed to it being equal amounts of uncomfortable and painful.
Actually, probably more if you just needlessly prolong the procedure, right? So it's probably more uncomfortable over the stretch of the entire procedure.
Yeah.
But your memory, your recollection of it is, oh, it wasn't so bad. Good stuff. So, Inyash, you would defend the original proposition of dust specks versus torture.
Yeah, I would defend that if we can put numbers on things, then we're putting fucking numbers on things, right? Are we or aren't we?
Sure.
And so is your guys' proposition that you can't put numbers on things?
That's not my proposition.
No. What I would ask in response to that is, how is that meaningful to apply numbers to this like really weird scenario of like dust specks versus torture? Like, what is that going to accomplish? Like, what is the actual like defending it and being like, we can condense this down to math and come up with an answer in terms of like the utilitarian perspective.
No one is suggesting there will ever be a situation in which it's 50 years of torture for an individual versus 3 to whatever number of dust specks.
Sure. So it's a thought experiment that plays off the idea that you can condense utility into math, and thus you must have the numbers correct. Basically, is what you're saying.
And whatever conclusion comes from that should actually be applied to every decision or most decisions that have to do with.
But aren't there some decisions where, like, the math it's like, okay, you can observe the math, but there's this... Maybe that's not the be-all, end-all, right?
The human spark.
In my opinion, the point is that it is the be-all, end-all, and this is pointing out that humans are very fallible and very likely to, as soon as something goes against their intuition, be like, oh, fuck no, we can't do numbers anymore, and it's trying to make you bite the bullet. So, for example, where people will be asked, how much money are you willing to give to have one seagull scraped of oil after the big oil spill happened? And it was like $10. How much money would you be willing to give to get 10 seagulls scraped clean from oil and they can go about their happy seagull lives? They're like, $20. And that's like, why were you willing to give $10 per seagull when there was only one, but only $2 per seagull when there were 10 of them?
Because you started with one question, and they're like, "Oh, for one seagull, sure, I'd give 10." Yeah, you're right. That's kind of inconsistent.
Right,
because the ape intuition sucks.
Yes, people are really shitty at intuition. But at some point, there should be an actual number that, given an undefined number of seagulls, you'd be willing to give this much money per seagull to clean them, regardless of how many there are. Right?
Sure, or maybe you set like a budget limit, and you're like, "I'm only willing to spend $100 toward seagull welfare," or well-being. This is my Seagull oil scrubbing budget.
Yes.
It's $100 right now.
But if you're actually trying to put a number that it is worth putting per seagull, this is actually very important because we do have a number of dollars we're willing to pay per human life.
Well, I was going to relate this to experiments that have been done with charities towards humans.
Okay.
And so one of the keys to doing this is you ask different groups. If you ask the same group, how much would you give to save this little girl, and how much would you give to save this little girl and her brother, the same people will scale up. I don't know if they'll actually double, but they'll scale up in some meaningful way.
But
if you ask different, well, they don't double, they're being inconsistent, assuming that their budgets aren't workable, right? Mm-hmm. But if you ask different groups and you show a picture of a little girl and say how much would you be willing to help this little girl out, they'll give some number, and I forget what it is, but we can look them up. If you show a picture of that little girl and her brother and say how much would you give to save the pair, if you ask that to a different group, it's typically less than on average people will give to save the girl.
So if the one
and if it's
little
that girl
X,
and her family of 8, people will give way less than they will to that one. And this is sort of a different problem than the Specks thing, but this idea of scope neglect that we suck follows from the same principle that our brains can't multiply emotions. I mean, and that sort of makes sense. On the fact that we just didn't have an intestinal environment that would sort of program that. But if we could, we would just shut down every time a disaster happened. You know, if we could actually understand how much it would suck for 200,000 people to die in a disaster, all of us would just kill ourselves, right? Like, it'd be bad enough for us to be able to emotionally understand that for 10 people.
Which is why I don't want to be a super happy.
Right.
Wait, why is it that you don't want to be a super happy?
In Three Worlds Collide.
Yeah, but why? I missed how what Steven said relates to why you don't want to be a super happy.
The super happies find out that the Star Trekian humans in that story allow for specific things, and everyone except the neutral party on the super happy ship passed out or blacked out or had to take a nap from the stress.
Yeah.
I mean, that almost sounds like an appropriate reaction if you learned about something terrible, right? And so, like, even the humans on the ship kind of realized that, like, man, our reaction to the babies being eaten was kind of mild compared to what it really should have been.
Right, but their reaction was to us allowing the emotion of embarrassment to exist.
Sure. This is all kind of an aside. You should read Three Worlds Collide. It's a fun, 6 or 7 chapter short story?
And the first 3 chapters are hilarious.
Mm-hmm. The first what?
3.
And what, do the Super Happy show up at what? 3 or 4?
Number 3.
I think it's 2.
Okay.
It's also in audio form on the Harry Potter and Methods of Rationality podcast.
But then you don't get to enjoy the comments per wiki page, which I think are quite worth it.
All right, there we'll link to both.
So this thing with the like doing the utility math is kind of like when there's a super powerful AI and there's a singularity, it needs to be able to solve all the trolley problems, basically.
Well, even we need to solve trolley problems a lot, right?
Well, sure, yeah. And we're eventually. I mean, there's this whole thing about like self-driving cars and like, if it has to make a trolley decision, like, we want it to be the correct one.
Yeah. But I mean,
Right.
anyone who works at a hospital, well, actually, I guess anyone who works with the budget at a hospital has to make trolley decisions every single time budget time comes around.
Sure, that makes sense.
So if you put a number on a human life, and we do, then you're saying that these numbers are important and that we should maybe shut up and multiply how many lives we can save per dollar as opposed to going with these squishy intuitions. And if we are saying that, yes, the math is the best way to do things because it gives us the greatest benefit, then we shouldn't all of a sudden abandon the math as soon as it says something that we think is not to our intuition.
And if this were in written form, Shut Up and Multiply would be a link to another podcast.
And it will be...
It's like a catchphrase or something?
Shut up and multiply, yeah.
Okay.
From Less Wrong. Yeah.
Oh, is it like expand the problem to figure out if it's... Like, if you have an idea about a small scope problem that you multiply or something?
Yeah, shut up and multiply means trust the numbers.
Okay.
Don't go with your...
So just do the math.
Yeah.
So,
I have a problem. I do have a problem with that in general.
Okay.
Like an example with the hospital that Enosh was mentioning, say if like one little girl needed a liver and the hospital director could buy one for $8 million and that would shut down the hospital, or however many dollars the hospital needs to not be shut down, or the director could keep the hospital running and save all the other lives and let that little girl die. Well, a lot of people will be like, well, you gotta save the little girl because the children and because life, and you can't put a price on a life. But one of the ideas of Shut Up and Multiply is just, look, you can and you have to and you can. So let's just not sit here and wring our hands needlessly. Let's just realize, yes, this little girl is going to die, and in exchange, the hospital is going to stay open and do all the great things that hospitals do, right?
Yeah.
So-
Right. Like, so I understand the concept. It's just that, like, and there are probably many situations in which doing the math makes a lot of sense, and that probably will yield the optimal outcome. But aren't there situations in which it wouldn't?
I believe that is the argument, that whenever someone gets to a point where there's something they're not willing to accept based on their squishy feelings, they say, well, this is one of those cases where the math doesn't apply. And the response, which I personally give, because I would not put these words in Eliezer, is fuck you, prove it. If you say the math always works all the time, except for the one case where your emotions are so important they overrule the math.
Well, not even just one. I mean,
I'm willing to, if you can, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you can think of something like one, we can try and develop a case where we'd all be willing to throw out the numbers.
If the whole conclusion of this is that we should trust the math on eudolons, and that...
Assuming we get the eudolon calculation right.
Sure.
That we can figure out how many eudolons torture actually is.
Sure.
Yeah.
Assuming that. The conclusion is we should trust the math on if a eudolon is a thing we can measure, we should go for the more positive eudolons or for the least amount of negative eudolons.
Yes.
And I think I can scale this up and argue against his entire dust speck versus torture conclusion.
Ooh, do that then.
So if all humans have a perfect 50-year lifespan, and the starting of this theory is a 50-year or one entire lifespan of torture versus a huge number of dust specks, then keep the torture where it is and scale up the dust specks to everyone getting 2 dust specks.
oh, scale it the other direction. So you're saying, like, increase the number of dust specks to reduce the amount of torture you'd have to offset that.
Right. So what if everyone has to be
Yep.
tortured? And
Okay.
everyone, like actual tortured and not dust speck tortured, say it's real torture for 1 year. I'm pretty sure everyone would argue that being tortured for your entire 50-year lifespan is not a life worth living. And so if life worth living is a different metric, not directly related to the eudolons from the dust speck argument, then you could reframe the argument of 3 to the third to the third to the third lives worth living versus 1 life not worth living. Say everyone has to have dust specks in their eye. It's just going to happen.
Okay.
Would you like to live in that world where dust specks fly into your eye? I'm assuming yes, seeing as you are in fact here.
Yes, definitely.
Would you want to live a life where you were tortured for 50 years, which happens to be your exact perfect measurement of lifespan?
No, of course not.
So is there somewhere in between where you draw the line?
Like where you would accept more torture than dust specks?
No, I think
Where you would
a certain
accept
amount
being
of torture
tortured
for a good life. Like, most people, I'm assuming, would not be willing to be tortured for 49 years to have 1 year of wonderful life.
Oh, I see.
I'm gonna
what you're
draw the line at 10%,
Okay.
just to get the conversation
Giving
going.
what you can.
Yeah, 10 exactly. That number's on my head. Giving what I can. I'll give 10 years. You can
5 years.
strap me to the table. Oh,
saying.
right.
Well, 10%, so that'd be 5 years, right?
Well, I imagine living longer than 50 years, but yeah, you're right. So I see what you're going at, but I feel like that's a different problem.
It's a different problem, but it attacks the same conclusion.
So where does this leave us?
Okay, so it brings us back to you. I remember while we were talking at the meetup. By you, I am pointing at Sean, sorry.
Hi.
Sean at the meetup is one of the people who has read Those Who Walk Away from Omlettes. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced.
Yeah, I always said Omlettes, or I think some people say Omlettes.
Okay. Which is how
Ursula-
you can tell that Sean is one of the better kind of people.
I guess. I mean, it's so yeah. For those who don't know, I mean, most people probably are aware of it. But like, short story written
I'm
by.
feeling really stupid now.
No,
Never heard of this.
It's not one of those things you
haven't
either know
either.
it or no, you don't. It's trivia, right? It's
I'm just a shitty person, according to
Do
you.
it, trivia gets you free beer.
Ursula.
Well,
Yeah,
I mean,
no.
I've
Well,
thought
hey,
that for a long time, though.
Ursula K. Le Guin wrote this short story called "Those Who Walk from Omlettes" or Omlettes.
One of the most famous short stories in science fiction history.
Yeah,
Although science fiction history isn't all that long.
Oh, sure. No. And it's just this allegorical story about how America exploits third world working wages, basically.
Whoa.
Well, that's what a lot of people think, and that's what a lot of people speculate on.
So you are putting a lot of stuff onto that story, which is not in the story at all.
Okay. Well, let's forget I said that. Those Who Walk from Omlettes is about a utopian society in which everyone lives this perfectly happy life where there are no inconveniences and everyone, it's just peachy keen and awesome all the time.
And it's not like one of those shitty utopias where it turns out to actually, people aren't really happy. This is one of those utopias that if you were to make a utopia that is actually perfect for human flourishing and everyone would want to be there without any catches, it's that utopia.
Basically, yes. And
the culture?
The only way
That's what your utopia is, sure.
the only way in which it is possible for this utopia to exist in the way that it does is that there's this child, this tiny child that is locked away in a basement and just basically tortured all the time. Just constantly treated very, very, very poorly.
Do they stay a kid the whole time, or do they age?
This is a snapshot of a particular, but I mean, they don't really cover that exactly. But, however, the one thing that happens is that I believe everyone in the utopian society has to go down in that basement and look at the child and see what happens to it.
One time in their life. Yeah.
One time in their life. And some people go down there, look at it, are so disgusted that they walk away from Omlettes. Most people don't. Most people look at it and they go, well, that's unfortunate, and they go about their lives, and they just continue living in a utopia.
And it is an acceptable price to pay.
2 quick things. 1, I have heard of the premise of this, even if I didn't know the name. And 2, do they know what they're going to go look at?
I don't think so. No.
It's been...
So do they just say, hey, once in your life you have to make a pilgrimage to my basement?
Yeah.
But like,
It's
there's
kind of
no
spoken
like,
about-
it's not like you're not coming to look at my book collection. You're coming to look at something scary.
This is an interesting story because, as someone in my book club once pointed out, this is a story rather unique in that it has no characters and no plot, and yet it is still a very good story.
It's like everything's spoken about in generalities. There's no, exactly. There's no protagonist. There's basically just...
It's just a snapshot.
The author, it's a very conceptual thing. The author's not specific about anything. So any of the questions you have about like the specific conditions, I am completely unable to
Fair
answer.
enough. I'll need to read the whole thing, but I guess just for
It's really
It's really short,
like
yeah.
2 pages.
that's cool.
Exactly.
For entertaining it, just for the sake of thinking about it, to me there'd be a big difference if like you knew what you're going to go look at, and you had to live with that knowledge the entire time you're in this utopia. I feel like that would kind of detract from the fun of it.
Well, I mean,
so given that
once-
everyone's not having a bad time, I would
Once you've
think,
seen it, and it's implied that it's like sometime early in your life, sometime within the first 2 decades or so.
oh, so it can't be your last week.
No.
Oh,
no.
okay. So that's what I was going to say is like, if you're told
It's probably
at
something
birth,
you see at early adulthood or something.
okay, maybe it's like whatever. You can just speculate randomly when you turn 18.
Yeah.
When you're ready to vote or something, whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, so that makes sense. I was going to say.
I mean, it's kind of a rite of passage, yeah.
All right. So that changes it. That's interesting. So then that's the dust Specks conundrum writ large, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So it sounds to me like if you weren't living with the knowledge that somebody was suffering the entire time, because that would detract from your presumably from how happy you could get.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't want to be the kind of person who would be happy knowing that someone was being tortured for my happiness. But assuming I didn't know it, and I just found it out, in the last week or something, I'd still have a pretty good life, right? By the measure of the book, the best life possible.
Pretty much everyone who's read the story wants to think that they would be one of the people that would walk away. At least from what I've heard.
So does that mean they don't buy cell phones anymore? Because of the microprocessors, you know where I'm going with
I do know where you're going with this, yes. But no.
That's remote enough. They probably wouldn't visit a cell phone production factory in the third world, right?
Well, and even if they did, it's hard to opt out of life.
Yeah, but
You'd
you
have
could
to become a hermit in the...
Well, they
somewhere.
do make ethically produced phones. They're just ridiculously expensive,
And they're also
ugly,
like
and
shitty as hell compared to actual phones
And
that
again,
but they're
are more
functional.
harmful to the environment. So there's that too.
And again, that's one phone. Do you still drive a car? Do
Correct.
you burn oil? Do you go to McDonald's? Do you exist in a society where this is the foundations of everything that make us the society we are?
Fair enough. So would you stay? I get the impression that you're going to say you'd stay.
When I first read it, fuck no. I also thought of myself as one of those people who would walk away from Omlettes because that's horrific when you read that. You're like...
Yeah, it's a very emotionally impactful thing to have to witness,
Yeah,
right?
how bad is
wouldn't
life
it bother you
outs-
just so much? And
This cannot stand. I will not be party to this.
So if 50% of the people of the whole society all at once left because of that reason, would it make a difference?
Oh, it's implied that very few people actually leave.
But if
If
90% of the people of that society left because they didn't tolerate the child being tortured, would it change anything about the child being tortured?
no.
Then what's the point?
Right. The thing that finally changed my mind a little bit was reading Scott Alexander's post on those who walk away from Omlettes, or Omlettes, or however you pronounce it.
yeah, those
you-
walk away from Omlettes.
Right. Which kind of a monster walks away from an omelet,
Son of a bitch.
at least while it's still warm. We have a world where children are tortured in basements and live horrific lives for their entire life, and we don't get a utopia in return.
No, we don't. We get. I actually learned recently that Thorn, Ashton Kutcher, is the CEO of Thorn, and
What's Thorn?
it is software that helps combat human trafficking, like
Okay. How?
by scanning the dark net or the deep net or whatever it's
it's
called.
darknet.
It's darknet. It's
they're
supposed to
different things.
monitor the darknet for information so they can hand it off to like authorities to intervene, basically. That's all I know about it, because the only reason I even know about this is because I saw a video, like a 2-minute clip of Ashton Kutcher talking about it.
Does it actually work?
I could not tell you for sure. I know that they're hiring.
All right.
But a minor thing that I wanted to interject there.
Yeah, the point of the post is that we do have that kind of world with those children in it, and much worse things besides, on just orders of magnitude more scale. And we certainly haven't gotten a utopia out of it. So when you're walking away from Omlettes, you're walking into a world that is much, much worse. And if you were to stay in Omlettes, there would only be one child being tortured forever, and all this other good stuff comes because of it.
I think intent has a large part to do with that, though.
Yeah.
Intention-based morality?
It seems that Omlettes deals with the purposeful intent on torturing the child to maintain the utopia.
Or at least being complicit in it.
Yeah.
I think it has more to do with complicity, yeah.
Ours is just
Well, but I don't even know.
chaos.
Again, I'll read the whole thing. It's two pages. We should just stop while we all read it for 3 minutes. But since we're not going to do that, I'll just speculate that you're not really complicit if you're not making a decision to make it stop if you walk away.
Which was my point about if 90% of the people walked away, would anything happen?
No. So like,
And apparently not.
Sure.
But like, and you're not complicit in the fact that like you just have to go look. You don't have to pick up a knife and go help for 2 minutes, right? So
you don't.
No.
You just have to look at it.
You just have to look
at what's happening.
Yeah.
I think there was something like you're not allowed to say anything nice to the child, or like console it or make its life better. You're supposed to look. Maybe you don't have to actually actively contribute, but you can't intervene in a way that alleviates anything.
What a great thought experiment to control for that too. That's really interesting. I get that it's 2 pages. So they don't specify what life is like outside Omlettes.
Yeah,
The story is
So
2 pages?
That's what he just said.
It's 2 pages,
It is
and
a
the first-
short story.
Yeah, the first page and a half is basically saying how wonderful their society is. And then the second half of the page is describing how awful this child's life is. And then the very last paragraph is some people walked away.
Yep.
Basically.
So I mean, like if they walked away and they managed to recreate all the utopia without the tortured kid, obviously they're doing the right thing. Maybe. Well, I guess I mean
It's implied that you kind of need the torture for some reason.
right that there's some magic engine that's being turned on this kid's suffering, and it seems to me like it would be tough knowledge to bear. And I mean, I guess like you just have to take for granted that there's no way to fix it, that there's no way to correct this problem down the line or something, or that you can't work your whole life to make this kid's life any better no matter what. So like you just have to either like, well, are you going to stay here or are you going to go forage for dirt in the desert? It's like, well, I mean, I might as well stay here. You know, given that there's literally nothing I could do with my entire life to change this circumstance, he's going to be there whether or not I go to leave or not. Am I an asshole for deciding that?
No. Okay, because given that...
Well, no, like I wouldn't say you are, but I think it's reasonable for some people to be, because like if it's such an uncomfortable and torturous thought for them to acknowledge that they're part of this.
But I feel like they're as much of a part of it whether they live in the city or not. Like it's just a fact of nature, it seems like.
But they aren't profiting from it if they're not in the city.
Right.
Okay. That's
right. So
There's
I think there's some degree of being complicit.
Well, then that kid's suffering is just going to waste if you're not feeling good about it, right?
It's true.
So if Omlettes is in a solar system with 2 planets right next to each other, and both of them are Earth-like and full of greenery, and the one planet, Omelette, is magically fueled by the torture of this one kid, and the second planet is just like Earth minus humans. If the option of leaving means you have to go to that other planet, you are actually causing suffering in some way, in that if you're going to live there, you're going to have to hunt animals and eat them, and dig up the dirt and build a house and start polluting the area.
And not
so
live
on.
in utopia.
Right. Where if you're in the utopia and being there has literally zero influence on the bad part of that utopia, then it's should be your moral obligation to stay there.
That's sort of what I'm thinking.
Well,
and the other thing, so Eneasz mentioned the profiteering, and I wanted to clarify that as long as the kid's suffering is a fact of nature, and if it's nowhere known or implied that the suffering would stop, assuming everyone left, because then that would give you a way to alleviate the kid's suffering. You could get everyone
I think
out somehow.
everyone would have to leave.
So,
yeah.
But I mean, for the sake of making it hard, we could just say that the kid's going to be there suffering, making this perfect omelet planet forever, whether or not you're there or not. So it's like, well, as long as the kid's suffering, we can offset the balance of the universe, the Unilons writ large, over the course of everyone participating, if more people stayed in utopia, right?
Well, but isn't that kind of diffusion of responsibility where it's like, well it's going to happen anyway, I might as well stay. But if everyone thinks that, then...
But there's no responsibility in this thought experiment, right? That, like, it's not like there's anything anyone can do about it, even if the entire world ganged up to try and stop it, like, it's just going to happen.
Yeah, they don't really... I mean, again, they really don't get into... it's not like a huge world building scenario where they have this sophisticated, like, well-defined society. It's all very, very abstract and very, like... Ursula does not go into a lot of detail about it. It's just an allegory. It's like, I think it is.
Sure.
And to bring this back to the last episode you were on, it's kind of like the average citizen of Berlin going to in the 1940s, going to their desk job doing accounting every day and realizing that there's Jews being gassed somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Do we want to make excuses for that? Like, well, it's happening anyway. I might as well stay in this society.
Right, but you
Or
can
should
have an effect
everyone
on
have
that.
left? You what?
You can have an effect on that, no matter how small. It is a non-zero effect. Where I think the assumption for Omelette was that there is a non-zero effect you can have on the child, no matter what.
Or there is a zero effect you can have on a child.
Well,
Or-
you're
yeah,
not
yeah.
allowed to as long as you want to. As long as you want to be a part of the utopia, you have to have a zero effect on the child.
So you can help them. You can help the kid by leaving.
You could attempt to help
seem-
them.
Like, could
But
you
you get kicked out?
out of a population of I don't know?
I don't
how many,
remember
40
if there's a
million
part.
Germans. If you were to leave, would you make a difference to all those Jews that are being gassed?
Potentially, yeah.
How? Because that's actually an interesting question. Because I didn't like the original comparison because I'm sorry, I don't want to say omelet. What was the actual name of the story?
Omelas.
Omelas.
It's Omelas.
Right, but if you say omelet,
omelets.
we all know how to say omelet, and we don't waste time arguing about the
That's
pronunciation.
Omelas. That's fine.
In omelets, I liked Matt's solution. I'm picturing it just as the worst possible, as the least convenient possible world, right? And I'm imagining just you're forced to look through this window where you see into another dimension that you can't access. This kid being tortured, and you're told this kid is fueling omelets, or this kid's fueling the utopia. You leaving, or you doing anything? There's nothing you can do. You can either just stay and enjoy the utopia, or you can leave. Although it's interesting how it can still be a utopia when everyone knows it's run on torture. But that aside, the situation in Germany, you could hide Jews, you could smuggle them, you could fudge numbers to say, yes, we've shipped all ours out or something or whatever.
Or you could drag your feet and make the bureaucracy more inefficient.
Right. But so there are things you could do. Now, if your only choices were life as normal or leaving, that's actually an interesting situation. But that has to change so many factors about what was actually possible.
Right, that's
the
a
range of
false dichotomy.
possibilities.
But given that,
With me being contrarian, as soon as you started saying, I think that since the world is going to be the same, you have a duty to stay, I right away thought, well, do you have a duty to stay in Germany because they're going to keep doing things whether you're there or not, and your life is better in Berlin than if you were to become a refugee somewhere.
Jumping back to what you were saying.
jumping back to dust specks,
If you are willing to walk away from Omlettes, then I think you are one of the people that chooses dust specks, right?
You might be able to make that comparison. The only thing I would say is that those who walk from Omelas is a microcosm, like a very condensed microcosm of this thought experiment with the dust specks versus torture. Mm-hmm. Like, to the point where I don't know that you could actually make that claim. But conceptually, the people who walk away from Omelas, like, I have a moral objection to the idea that we should torture someone instead of having everybody have dust specks in their eyes because I reject the math.
and coincidentally,
That would roughly be equivalent to someone walking away from Omelas, right?
Do you believe that in principle there is a certain amount of distributed suffering that could be worse than 50 years of concentrated suffering?
Probably, yeah.
Okay.
It's just that dust specks, maybe dust specks is just not a good example because
I think it just counts as zero for you.
because it basically counts as zero, and I feel like that's one of those things that like it, and maybe I'm just projecting my sensibilities onto other people, but at the same time, it's like I think of whatever the equivalent is of an extremely minor inconvenience, like you said, 0.0000001, negative utilons or utils or whatever. If you distribute suffering in such a way that everyone's just going to get over it in 2 seconds, that there you go, like, end, done, slam dunk.
Do you not think that someone with an infinite lifespan couldn't get over 50 years of torture at some point?
Does that
question.
apply here? Because are we talking about human lives that have a finite span for which 50 years is very significant?
I think that as long as we're talking about more humans than can possibly exist,
Okay.
even if every atom was a universe,
Okay, so you're saying the perspective might be so different in that case for each individual human that has these incredibly elevated lifespans, perhaps, that 50 years is just like whatever, that's like 2 minutes for us.
not necessarily whatever. 50 years is still 50 years, but if you have a long enough lifespan, you can get over that, right?
If 50 years isn't 75% of your life and it's 0.1%, then
Maybe.
Yeah, then that does change the math, right? Then you're not talking about destroying someone's entire existence. You're talking about inconvenience or making them as uncomfortable as possible for a small amount of their life, but a large amount of time. But Matthew, you had a way to re-articulate the way that you were thinking about comparing what you were saying earlier. I don't want to paraphrase you poorly.
So the dust speck versus single-person torture seems like a false dichotomy because we are only measuring negative eutylons, in which, obviously, if we are only measuring negative eutylons, we want less negative eutylons rather than more negative eutylons.
But in this case, would the 50 years of torture just be so exponentially more that it's not even comparable to dust specks, even if you multiplied it by this ridiculous number?
Well, I mean, that's not possible if we're talking about numbers, right? At some point, unless you're talking about literal infinities, if you multiply a small number by a large enough number, it gets bigger than a certain other number.
Which is where my argument of life worth living metric comes into play. If I prefer any number of lives worth living over making one life not worth living, then that counters Yudkowsky's argument about dust specks versus torture. Because dust specks is very easy to live with.
I have a way that I was trying to think of how to flip this. Does anyone know if Zimbabwe dollars are worth literally more than zero? Wasn't it like they were so much less worth than the paper they're printed on? Was it Zimbabwe dollars or what was it?
I know
some currency crashed
American
last year.
pennies?
I wanted something way less than American pennies.
But
Okay.
there have been a number of currencies throughout human history that have gotten to the point where the paper that they're printed on is worth significantly more than the currency that's printed on.
Wasn't there something just like a year or two ago where that currency collapsed? Let's imagine one where it's worth 1,000th of an American penny.
Just a tangent I remember hearing not too long ago about a place where people would rush the supermarkets and try to stay in front of the guy who's putting the prices on things because inflation was so rapid that they would have a guy going around constantly putting the prices of things up throughout the day. And if you got to the thing before he came around to put the higher price on it, you could take it to the cash register and pay the lower price.
You would think if it's that bad, they would just go back to the barter system, full stop.
And probably a lot of it, I'm assuming that there was a big gray market that was on barter as well. But it was a podcast that was specifically tackling that econ problem and how they eventually got over it. And it was just one of the examples they used was the inflation was well over 100% per day. Sorry.
Oh no, that was a fun thing. This was what 1920s, 1930s.
Which one?
The
one I'm talking about?
Yeah.
No, it wasn't even that long ago, like a decade or two ago.
Oh, but not
South America.
Oh, okay, yeah, not in the U.S. then.
No.
Or in Europe, there's another big crash like that I remember hearing about where there was like there's pictures that exist, so I know it was not too long ago.
People carrying wheelbarrows of money.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe that was Weimar Germany. That
Or
was one of the reasons
of toilet paper probably is where it would have been, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so I guess I wanted to give a reverse of the dust speck experiment. So let's say we can give everyone on Earth, whether they have a bank account or some way of keeping track of how much money they have. I know a lot of people don't have, like a lot of people on Earth don't have money. They barely have an equivalent of money, but let's say they could get one extra calorie of crop that day or something, whatever it is, right? Or one extra calorie of crop yield. We could increase their spending power by, let's say, 100th of an American penny. We could do that to everybody on Earth today, or we can give one person $10 billion.
And the assumption is he's going to spend it on himself rather than like donate it to.
Oh, I see. You're using positive utils here.
I was trying to think of positive utils, but that is the difference in that I couldn't think of one in the midst of the conversation without losing track of what you guys are all saying completely.
So distribute like teeny bit of like money versus one person gets 10 billion that could do a lot more of that 10 billion. Basically.
Well, the amount of people getting it is a Googleplex and not 7 billion.
Yeah, and I guess the other difference too is that it's hard to spend $10 billion without it making someone else's life better. I mean, you're buying a yacht from somebody, or you're buying an island or whatever it is. So I guess I was trying to think, and maybe I failed to generate a positive util example of this.
No, I believe in the comments there was a positive util example where it was a 1 second cat video was the smallest positive uton. And I don't remember what the maximum uton was, like a life of
an hour-long cat video.
You just like
maybe like an entire lifetime of orgasm or something. I don't know.
Yeah, basically you have a harem of
cat girls
X, and that harem tends to your every sexual need, basically, for your whole life.
Just jump to wireheading; it's simpler.
Well, dude, at that point, just just inject a bunch of dopamine into the brain, or I mean, not really, but you know what I mean.
So let's say you could just be the very best at the thing you like doing most. Because that's an actual.
You take the
legit
orange pill in
utopia,
his. I liked. You take the
orange
orange
pill?
pill. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but there's this thing that Scott Alexander wrote about with the pills. It's like this little fiction thing. You know those memes where it's like, which pill would you take? And the orange one was like, master every human skill. I would like 100% take that one. It's awesome. Yeah. Anyway.
Wasn't one of them like superpowers? Anyway, we'll figure that one out later. Maybe we can argue about that
very
one.
limited in scope.
We can argue about that next time because I'm sure there's some way to Munchkin one of the superpowers that'd be way better than anything.
There is.
The story is about Munch getting the superpowers.
Yeah, exactly. Scott Alexander made a very good case for orange, but anyway.
So
And I agree with him.
I was just trying to think of a positive utility example to maybe pump our intuitions the other way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Sure.
So is there any level of a number of people that could exist seeing 1 second of cat video that would equal a lifetime of perfection?
Yeah, 40. No, I'm kidding. I like cats more than the average person, so I'll
Disagree.
pick something.
46.
I'll pick something less. You know, like it could be like just an extra tiny bit of sweetness to something they ate or something, right?
I don't know. Does that 1 second of cat video improve someone's life so much that they?
It's supposed to improve it minutely, right?
It's relative, extremely minute improvement.
Yeah. So
Regardless of what that
I'm
improvement
the
is.
example of the person whom a dust speck would kill in the reversed experiment, right? Because I like cats that much. Not really, but I'm just ruining the thought experiment because I'm bored.
As long as we're ruining things.
Would you rather be?
If there are that many people, one of them would just be, oh god, the dust speck would be the worst thing ever, right?
Would you rather have
Statistically.
happiness specks thrown into everyone's eye exactly one time versus this one dude just getting smothered in happiness dust specks?
In this example, my intuitions pump the other way, where I think, I feel like dispersing that happiness is better, but if I actually sit and do the math, like I did with the torture problem, I'm pushed the other way, right? There's one person. There's actually.
I would assume the other way around, but that's theoretically.
So you
right?
would go for the big 50 years one in that case, right?
In terms of positive utility,
Yeah.
I mean, I would right now. My answer to that is probably yes.
I'm digging up a.
It seems more appreciable. It seems to be a more appreciable benefit than some extremely minor, like, oh, that was cool. Okay, I'm done thinking about how cool that was. And then meantime, you're going to have other like happy and bad things happen in your life. And comparatively, those happy things, those happiness spikes that you have, I mean, they're not continuous, but
That is a consistent position, right? Because we're
Yeah,
saying that the total happiness is more when you have that tiny bit of sugar in your tea. And so that would be the correct answer to choose. And yet we're still going with the one person getting all the happiness because we can see that effect.
I wouldn't.
Oh, you would go with the tiny bit of sugar spread out among everyone?
Yes.
Okay.
It's easier, more intuitive to go with Steven's argument about the dollar amounts.
like I can't help but think that in all these cases, like unless you know the specifics of how it's going to affect people or what's going to change, then it's kind of hard to just make a call like this is always true, this is always false. Like I would always go with this answer, I would always go with this other answer.
So like you could just make it as abstract as possible to make that really easy, right? You could just say everyone on Earth gets 0.0001 plus 1 or plus, that percentage of utils, or one person gets a billion or a trillion or whatever number you want to throw at it, right? And so
Sure.
then that way you don't even have to say, well, what about the
You
possibilities?
don't have to think about
you
like
just
torture or dust specks. You just think about actual utils.
right. So this relates to a kind of fun thought experiment that is a kind of challenge to utilitarianism that the author of the webcomic Saturday Morning Breakfast cereal independently invented, called the utility monster.
Wait, Zach came up with that independently?
Yes.
I'm really surprised because he's so well read. I would assumed he would have run into that. Was this early on in his career?
I'm pretty sure he was on an episode of Rationally Speaking, and Julia asked him about that,
Okay.
and I'm 90% sure he said he thought of it by himself.
Neat.
Anyway, so the idea is that you could say one person on Earth is just, for whatever quirk of nature, just made way happier by things than the average person is. And so if you're going to go by like total amount of happiness, this one person, their utility range accounts for like a third of happiness on Earth. If you go by how much pleasure they can get out of things, like them finding,
It takes someone $10 to be a little bit happier. This guy for $10 feels like someone who's won the lottery.
Sure. Yeah. Well, isn't that kind of like why you abstract the utility? I mean, that's what you're.
But I'm getting at just another fun little way of so one of these. This whole problem is just like, do you go with like totals or averages, or
If you're trying to maximize total utility in the universe, you give this monster all the utility there is. Everyone else lives in absolute poverty because their poverty is it's not worth giving them an extra $10 because no matter who you give the extra $10 to, this guy enjoys it so much more, you get more utility in the universe if you give it to him.
right?
And it is supposed to make you make that look because everyone is like, That's fucked up. Fuck that guy.
Yeah, that guy sounds like a real asshole, and I don't even know him.
Well, but it's not even.
And I even applied to gender. I assumed his gender. I'm a shitlord.
So it's the idea is that this person is just capable of so much more, and this is actually not inconceivable for like say,
Ayn Rand in here now.
designing minds from scratch, right? You could design a super intelligence that its range of experience just puts it way above, like it puts us, it's like relates to us in the way that we do to ants, right?
Well, I mean,
and so
I love that you brought that up because I like the argument that we have met the utility monster and he is us. That humans have decided that we are capable of so much more intellectually and emotionally, and our lives are just so much richer and more important that we don't care about the other animals, really. They don't count.
Well, they came into algebra, I mean...
Right, exactly. The few utils that, a chicken could get throughout its entire life is we get more utils than that from eating that chicken by an order of magnitude, so it's totally worth it.
So many vegetarians disagree with that math, and that's why they're vegetarians.
Yes.
But
Yes.
The point could be taken, and I think that defeats the idea of the one utility monster. Like, it's not one
We're
super
a species of utility monster.
Yeah, so like there's a difference between that and like just one person hogging all the utils, right? So like at least it's divided. And this is actually this leads into another really fun thought experiment by Derek Parfit from his 1984-86 book called of Reasons and Persons, I think it's called, but now I'm hedging on that. Anyway, it's the idea of the repugnant conclusion, and he can daisy chain you along this path where you could say, I'll try and be brief, but it's really worth diving into. The idea is that you could say, all right, well, we've got a world populated entirely by people who are just as happy as possible.
1 million maximally happy people.
Right. And then you could typically get people to agree, the way that he lays these things out, that if we introduce some people who are 9.8 out of 10 on the happiness scale to this world, now there's 1.5 million, well, that's a better world. There's more happiness. 9.8 is good. 10 is the best. And then you can get it to kind of where you just slide the scales down, where say you get people who are at, you get half the population's at 6, and the other population is at 8, but that's still better because there's more of them. Okay. So it does take a couple minutes to get all the way into, but it's a fun, and I've mentioned this like 3 times, so we should just get into it at length later, but I'm not feeling completely collected right now.
I've heard the same thing. It's a great thought experiment. Like, if 1 million extremely happy people is great, 2 million almost as happy people seems like pretty good still as well. Maybe even better, right?
Is the conclusion that there's a certain level of happiness?
You keep adding people, you keep doubling the amount of people, and every time you double the amount of people, you decrease the total happiness just a little bit.
Is there a specific line where you stop because it's not worth it?
Right, exactly.
And
because
if
at
so,
some point you get down to very miserable people,
right,
and you can double the amount of people that there are, and they're slightly more miserable, but they're still up on the positive side of the scale. Ultimately, you never get to the negative side of the scale, because at that point you say, let's stop making people. But as long as you keep reducing the average happiness of any one person by a little bit, but you double the amount of people, you increase the total utility.
And they have no effect on the previous people.
The idea, just really quick, is also that these people still have lives worth living.
Yes.
That it's not like they're barely subsisting or they're suffering their entire lives. They're just, things are okay. There's fewer TV shows to watch in one version of this. Food tastes a little less sweet. Things just get a little bit worse, but like they still have overall good lives. The repugnant conclusion is that you could end up with, by daisy chaining along this line, I mean, if you just jump straight there, then people kind of aren't willing to jump, but they're willing to walk, and they're willing to say, all right, cool. So I'll take a world with 10 billion people who, are only kind of happy for the most part, as opposed to a world with 1,000 maximally happy people.
So you have 1 million people with happiness level 8, right? Why is adding more people better outside of more utility, which is kind of like just kind of a weird abstract measurement in the first place? It's like, so why even add people? Because if they don't exist, they have no.
I'm going to ask you personally, does it seem kind of like a dick move if there's 1 million people on the Earth for you to say, I don't think I'm willing to take a tiny decrease in my quality of life so that there can be another 1 million people having this wonderful life? Would you be willing to take just a tiny decrease in your quality of life so that
certainly.
Another 1 million people can have great lives?
Well, certainly, but
and then you just keep repeating that step ad nauseum.
Oh, right. No. Like I see where you're going. I'm just like thinking in a very specific situation where it's like, here we are, snapshot of this world. We have 1 million people. We have to make more people in the first place to elevate them to a certain level of happiness that is like an average of everyone in the world, or whatever it is that. If there are 1 million people that at level 8 and you add another million people and you decrease that to like 7.5 for everyone, right? Like, obviously you'd be like, oh yeah, that doesn't sound bad at all. But I mean, I'm just thinking in terms of like, why, like, where do the extra people come from? Why would there be more people?
I don't know. They teleported in from the dimension of non-existence.
I mean, they're there for the thought experiment to exist, right? So, kind of like where these dust specks come from.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, that's why it's called the repugnant conclusion, because eventually people are like, well, that's a shitty conclusion. I'd rather have the first one.
Yeah, right. You're very slowly raising the temperature or decreasing the temperature, right?
Every single step along the way makes perfect sense.
Oh yeah, the
And
baby steps make sense, of course. It's really it's not very contentious, right? Because it's just
That's why it's one of my favorite ones. It's not one of those ones that you can just shoot a hole in if it's delivered
you
right.
have to see it ahead of time. You'd be like, oh, you're going to keep doing this. Like after the first step, you're like, oh yeah, totally I do it. And then the second step, you're like, oh, he's going to keep doing this. And eventually, I see where you're going with this. Oh, I see you.
As long as the lives are worth living, as perceived by the people that are living the lives, I would assume that it should go on indefinitely.
Ooh.
Until you get to the point where it's not worth living and then stop.
You're taking that bullet then.
So you're going to write it all the way to the bottom and say lives that are barely worth living are...
If you ask the people at the end of their life, would you rather have never existed or have lived this life?
And they kind of go like, meh, I guess.
As long as it was on the yes spectrum?
Fair enough. So yeah, you're going to ride that slope all the way to the bottom. I like it.
Right, but I'm going to stop at that point where the bottom is.
Yeah, I think that's where you're supposed to stop.
And on the other side of that bottom is being tortured for 50 years.
Right. At the other side of the slope, you get dust specks, and then you go all the way to everyone being tortured forever.
Yeah.
Well, you go from you're 10 out of 10, but the people after you are 9.99 because they're getting dust specks.
Right. Fair enough.
Were any of you raised in the Christian background? I know you.
Yes.
Vaguely. I was raised
kind of Catholic, but I never really bought into it.
After I learned of the utility monster, I kind of had the intuition that it feels like God is the utility monster. That he matters so much that all of humanity doesn't really matter. We're here just to praise him and, feed him utils, because he's the only being that matters in the universe.
I've also heard the same thing about a singularity.
It depends on what kind of singularity God you're trying to make, but I also don't like using the word God for the AGI. But as far as the God of Christianity, I think that's kind of the point, in that
AGI.
You would get a large percentage. I think with the Christian God example, I think that's kind of the point, that God does matter that much. That's why you can't indulge in your petty pleasures like masturbation, because look at how much that'll make God sad. And his happiness matters so much more than yours.
I'm pretty sure Christians would argue that you cannot make God sad.
In any case, we're getting kind of off track.
Yes, okay. Yeah, do we want to go on to listener feedback?
Do we have any?
Yeah, I got some.
All right, let's do that real quick.
Nice.
You guys can chime in if you want. It'll be fun.
So Eddie says on our Punching Nazis episode, the Superman radio series Clan of the Fiery Cross is well worth listening to, if nothing else than for the old-timey radio ads. It was hosted on the Superman homepage for a while, but I couldn't find it. It is easily found on YouTube. Thank you, Eddie. All right. Econ Detective on our Signaling episode says, in response to the idea that cash is the ideal gift, I have an alternative theory. When computers are trying to solve complex maximization problems, one feature many algorithms have in common is randomization in the early stages. Without randomization, they tend to get stuck at local optimum while missing out on some other global optimum. In our consumption decisions, we're trying to optimize across the space of all consumption bundles with limited knowledge of what's available. Consequently, we might get locked into a local maximum without discovering some better option that exists out in the world. Consider the case where someone discovers a lifelong love of painting because someone bought them art supplies as a gift. The value of that discovery could be valuable enough to cancel out hundreds of useless gifts. So my theory is that it might be worthwhile to put up with many suboptimal gifts because the random factor they add to our consumption decisions actually helps the discovery process.
I can see the benefit of that, and it would make Christmas kind of fun. I could give my entire family $20 each or whatever, or I could go out and just throw an arrow and just like grab something random off the shelf and be like, you're getting a beach ball, you're getting an air horn, I don't know, whatever it is, right? So
I think the random discovery thing is actually really important, and I love that he brought that up because now I am feeling much better about gift giving.
Perfect.
Random discovery is really cool. I at least 2 times in my life, I have decided that I need to change something, and so what I did was just, with some minor exceptions for things that are really just obviously terribly stupid ideas, anything that I get asked, my answer is yes.
Can I have $20?
I'm not in one of those phases.
Damn it.
That's basically a random number generator for life events. Because you get asked things at random, especially if you're on Facebook. Every now and then someone will be like, oh my god, can anyone drive me to the airport? Or some shit like that. And I'm like, yep, right here. And it has led to experiences that I never would have had and thrown my life on very different directions, and I like it. I strongly recommend everyone try some random number generation in their life at some point.
You're also choosing which gifts to receive in that example, though.
Which gifts to receive?
The gift of being stuck in a car driving someone to the airport.
Oh, no, I mean, it was literally a policy of, unless it is something that could be severely harmful for me, I don't know, do drugs with me, would you help me bury a body? Anything that isn't that massively negatively impactful on my life, I just say yes to.
All right.
If it's something that I would really hate and sounds shitty as fuck, I'm like, whatever. I'm saying yes to everything, so I'm saying yes.
So that's what you mean by RNG is saying yes to. It's like
all of the things.
No, not necessarily. But I mean, if that is one great way to make an RNG in your life. No matter what you hear, say yes to it. Even if you're sure it's something that you will hate, say yes anyway, because fuck it.
I'm actually convinced by what you just said, and I'm definitely going to try that because that sounds. I don't do a lot. I pass up opportunities to get out all the time. Mm-hmm. If I just did a month where I'm like, I'm going to say yes to everything. That's convincing to me. I'm going to give it a shot and I'll report back eventually when I get around to doing that.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Hey, Steven, can I have $20?
I haven't started.
Will you let me know when you have?
Don't let yourself
I haven't started, so I'm going to say no.
Yeah, you ain't
Caught me.
Ironclad, you're not falling for anything.
Yes.
On the list of things that I'm not going to do, it's going to be everything Matt asks. Do we have any? I think we had a few more.
Sure. When you and me and Katrina were talking about how the term social justice warrior, I thought wasn't negative at first.
You didn't, like whether it's like kind of pejorative?
Yeah. I was my impression that originally it wasn't because I liked that term, but it turns out I'm kind of a stupid head or something.
More people more often, I think, use it as a pejorative. But like, some people do wear it as a badge of honor. Like, yeah, I fight for social justice.
Anyone who
I'm a social justice cleric.
Anyone who would pejoratively be called a social justice warrior, that person would likely not have called themselves that.
Oh,
I challenge. I feel like a lot of people you can get online where they can be like, I'm doing social justice. That's why I'm harassing this person into
sometimes because people like to do the whole like signally like, oh, I'm a social justice paladin. They'll make like they'll throw in other D&D classes and stuff. But that's kind of like jokey too.
I would like to use myself as an example because back when I was more into social justice before it became what it is today, I actually did use the term social justice warrior for myself because I was like, yeah, that's a good term, right? We're fighting for social justice. Why wouldn't we be social justice warriors?
And it's because it's an offshoot of like keyboard warrior,
Yeah, exactly.
Which you talked about in the previous one.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So I didn't actually listen to that one. That was just
So it turns out that it was actually always pejorative. I'm just dumb.
Well, I mean, you took the obvious interpretation, just not the popular one.
I guess, kind of like the same way that I thought when Neil deGrasse Tyson was saying that 7% of scientists still believe in God. And
it's probably more than that, isn't it?
Well, no, 7% of at the very highest level at the National Academy of Sciences.
Gotcha.
Still 7% of those believe. Huh. And my interpretation was that he was saying, what the fuck is wrong with these 7%? When it turns out he was saying the opposite, that as long as these 7% believe, you got a problem on your hands, atheists. And I like my interpretation better.
And I don't necessarily know if that's his interpretation. I think what he's saying is that you can be as versed in science as you want, but that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be an atheist. I don't think he's saying checkmate atheists. I don't think he's even saying check atheists. I think he's just pointing out that some people can live with cognitive dissonance.
It's more like check yourself atheists rather than checkmate atheists.
I interpreted completely wrongly, is what I'm saying. I kind of have a record of interpreting things that make me happy.
I think most humans do.
Yeah? Okay.
It's called bias.
Yeah. I have a pro-happiness in my life bias, and it's not served me well.
I have similar issues that we can dive into another time.
Okay.
I turned out to be super gullible. Mm-hmm. All right, so we'll dive into a quick example. Like when I was a kid, I remember watching on TV some reenactment, and I didn't know it was a reenactment. Someone was being attacked by a dog or something. It was something just happened to be on the TV, and my parents didn't screen what was on when I was in the room. And I'm watching this, and I'm like, I don't know. I was under 7 because I think I vaguely remember it being in my first childhood home and we moved when I was 6. I'm watching this and I turn to my mom and I'm like, why isn't the person in the camera helping? Why are they just watching and getting this on tape? And she's like, they recreated this for TV. They're dramatizing it for people to, just show a story of what happened. And I was like, oh. And like the idea that they would fake it never occurred to me. I also used to think that when they would do flashbacks to childhood in TV shows, that they actually like filmed that scene with that actor 20 years ago and then waited 20 years to film the rest of the movie.
Damn, dude.
So but
the Boyhood movie.
I guess I have this weird compunction for like assuming that there's no trickery involved.
Yeah, I've been very gullible.
What you see is what you get.
Yeah.
Child logic.
Yeah.
I mean, that is child logic, but even as an adult, I tend to believe people way too much. Even sometimes when people are just joking, and I'm like, really? That's fascinating. I'm like, no, you dumbass.
You're just not snarky enough then.
I guess.
Well,
Yeah, I'm getting more jaded, so hey.
Yeah,
welcome.
whereas now we have to fact check everything. No, everything you read is just like, yeah, I don't know if that's true. I don't know if I believe that, no matter how plausible it may seem.
But Econ Detective also says, on the SJW thing, the way I understand it, SJW isn't a blanket term for everyone interested in social justice, but a specific term for the people who violate liberal norms of political discourse.
So they're more focused on the warrior than the social justice.
Right.
Like,
As in they're being racist by hating on white people.
or they're making extremely emotional arguments, or they're pro-violence or something like that.
Or like I've seen like again, just like picturing the extreme examples just to make it an obvious case. Like I saw things picking on the person who played Luke Cage.
Luke Cage. Okay.
I think he's married to a white woman or dating one or something when the show came out, and people were like, "Oh my god, how could you turn on your people?" And these were like social justice warriors.
What?
So like you get this horseshoe of people like on the KKK.
Those are like the extreme, like, worst people.
Yeah. So like, but what I'm getting at is that at the extremes,
They're against-
they tend to share the same.
Yeah, they're against
bigotries.
interracial marriage.
Yeah.
Just like racist slave owners.
Right.
Yeah, I think a lot of the problems with that has to do with, and I'm gonna be very brief about this, is that a lot of people conflate the idea of systemic racism or systemic sexism with like individual level, sexism or racism, and that cuts in all directions, right? Mm-hmm. But they conflate those two, so they're like, oh, whatever, cry me some more white tears, or even if they're talking to one person that they're insulting or berating a lot, And that's kind of like, well, you're directly, dealing with one person here that you are being that way.
Yeah. So, yeah, his entire next paragraph was basically examples, very much like you guys just made. So I'm going to skip that paragraph and move on to the summary that social justice warriors are people who think their political and social goals are so important that they need to jettison the idea of living peacefully in a society with people who disagree.
In other words, punching Nazis.
Yes.
That would be among one of the, among many others.
So the guy on Tinder that was talking to Katrina was trying to lump all people who have similar views about gender into the category SJW, which is a little like comparing all Second Amendment people to Timothy McVeigh.
It's a fun comparison.
He also goes on to say it's really hard to have consistent definitions of anything with respect to the culture war because people will try to bend definitions to make their friends seem better and their enemies seem worse. It's probably best to avoid buzzwords like SJW, alt-right, MRA, etc. altogether.
Yeah, I think you could just stop saying social justice warrior and call them a regressive left.
Yeah.
Or just an asshole. That's a word that we can all agree on the definition of.
Well,
yeah, some of them are.
I think it's good to point out regressive left as meaning they're on the left, which generally aligns themselves with progressivism, but they're asking for regressive options.
I'm drawing this horseshoe in the air with two hands, and I think the regressive part is when you
where it curves back?
Is when you get curved in right next, and you're bumping shoulders with the KKK,
thing.
right? No, I think that's an important distinction because it's like, man, you guys are kind of operating on the right wavelength, but you're doing it so badly. You're doing it so wrong.
If the things they were crying for were taken literally, in other words, if what they argued for became policy, it would actually have a negative effect overall. And it would be non-progressive.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, we talked about, like, none of us like it when Richard Spencer opens his mouth and says, asshole things.
Yeah, but
none of us are prepared.
We can't just punch him.
None of us are prepared to hit him over it. So that's what you're trying to get at, right?
You're basically saying, well, then if we kept that law and sent that law back in time, we'd lock away Galileo.
Or took it forward and we'd lock away really anyone who ever made the law disagreed with, right?
Right.
So that's sort of the problem. Anyway.
On Reddit, Zeke Aaron says, if you want to have something to remember a charity gift with, you could always print out the receipt and fold it into a small paper crane. Everyone has a shelf somewhere. Eventually you might have a whole shelf of origami representations of donations. I thought that was a wonderful idea.
It's cute, but you'd have to have enough different shapes. Otherwise, you have 10 cranes, and I don't remember what 10 gifts these
different
were.
colored paper.
Yeah, they make different colored and patterned origami paper.
I mean, you can't. I'm just like, I love the idea of having a shelf of cranes, and every single crane is another donation that someone made for me to a charitable cause. I was like, that would be really cool. I would like that.
Oh, was that for donations, or was that just for any gift? I missed the.
No, it was specifically for charitable gift donations.
Oh, then I think that's awesome.
Donations
Okay, yeah.
that you've given?
No, that
No
other
receipt.
people have given to you.
Oh, okay.
Hey, instead of giving you a $25 gift card to Walmart, I donated $25 to the ACLU, and here's the receipt. I printed it out.
Sure,
you could put that up on the wall and frame it, but that would be kind of
Pretentious.
tacky.
Yeah.
Where the cranes sounds prettier.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I got you.
Isn't there? My only source on this is the Ghost in the Shell series. But isn't there some sort of old, not superstition, old story that if you fold 1,000 origami cranes in your life, you get a wish?
That's certainly outside of Gits.
That's not there's a short story, Sadako and the 1,000 Paper Cranes. She has cancer.
Yeah.
She's this girl who has cancer. She has
Yes.
like leukemia, and she dies before. Spoilers. I think she dies like 2 cranes before or something. It's some really small number.
Okay.
I probably got her name wrong.
Is it 1,000? That's not a lot.
I thought it was.
I can do 1,000 before I die of
1,000.
leukemia pretty quickly.
It might have been.
It was 1,000 Ghost in the Shell. I'm assuming
Okay.
it was probably 1,000 in the story as well, because it sounds like they took it from something that already exists.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's like a short story. I'm pretty sure, right?
Okay.
Yeah,
There's
I think
three
I
of the
heard
third
about
of
it
the
before
third
Gits was an
cranes.
anime.
I don't know. 1,000's a fair amount. I mean, you could do 1,000 in your lifetime, but it wouldn't be fast. Even counting to 1,000 is a pain in the ass. Have you tried counting to 1,000 before?
I think she was doing it herself, and her hand, like, she was in a lot of pain all the time. So
Okay.
it was, like, laborious
Extra.
and very difficult. It was, like, but she had to be the one to do it, otherwise she didn't get her wish.
Okay, so if we just gave her cyborg arms, she'd be fine.
Yeah, but I mean,
Well, in the Ghost in the Shell, that was the thing. She was still learning how to use her cyborg body. and
That's
so-
why I...
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. I totally plan to have a shelf of origami cranes someday.
I think that's a great idea, and I thought that the original proposition was just for gift receipts. Like you said, you don't remember what people give you because it's mostly garbage. So it's like, well, a shelf of garbage paper isn't going to help either. But of knowing, being able to look at it and be like, oh, this is all, life-saving money. That's that is a great idea. I'm very much in support of it.
Yeah. Elk12429 says, on the subject of gift cards, I remember hearing about a psychological phenomenon that helps it to make more sense. The anecdote I heard is, a father wants to buy his daughter and her husband expensive tickets to a baseball game, but it's too close to the date of the game to get the tickets and have them shipped to her. So he transfers the money equal to the amount of the cost of the tickets to her with a note saying, use this money to buy the tickets. A week passes, he calls her up, turns out she didn't buy the tickets with the money because once the money was in her account, the tickets seemed too expensive to use that money on, even though she'd received the money unexpectedly, and she thought she'd just keep the money instead. This phenomenon is used to justify gift giving as opposed to giving cash. It lets you buy something for someone that increases their utility that they would not have bought themselves. And gift cards are a useful middle ground. Giving a person a gift card to a specific store rather than cash gives them a restriction on how the money can be used that enables them to bypass the I can't justify using money to buy this thing even though I would enjoy having it filter in their brains.
That's a compelling point if that's what you're going for. For me, if I was given a $50 gift card to GameStop, I would go buy whatever video game. If I was given $50 in cash, I'd hold on to that because $50 right now would be awesome. Not like, but it would just be nice to have like an extra $50, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess it depends on what the gift giver is going for. Do they care more about like what you actually want or what they want you to have? And if they want you to have another video game but they don't know which one or whatever, then get them the gift card. But if they just want you to get whatever you want or be $50 happier, they could just give you cash.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And you could be one of 3 people. You could be scrounging so much that it's almost insulting to receive $50 for GameStop when you could spend it on money so that you could survive.
right.
Or you could make so much money $50 doesn't matter either way, and being given the game would still barely matter. Or you could be the majority of people in the middle where you're not dying of starvation and you could definitely use that, but maybe you wouldn't use it for the GameStop product.
Yeah, I think that's where this is targeted for, is that large middle section.
Right.
And I think that makes a lot of sense.
And you should buy the Steam gift card anyway.
Right. Assuming
gonna say,
you
what
own computer games.
Like GameStop is good for console games, but not so much.
The key is that they
PC
know
games
enough
you can
about
just
you.
Download.
The key. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think the key is that they know enough about you to get you
Yeah.
an appropriate gift card. I heard you like video games, so here's a gift card for
yeah.
GameStop. It's like, oh, I do all my gaming on Steam. Then it's kind of a waste, right? Then they've misfired, and then you have to find some way to exchange that for money that you can turn into
Yep.
Steam money.
Yep.
So I just wanted to clarify. I'm now keeping a list of what constitutes the Ubermensch in my mind. One of them is has read walks away from those who walk away from Omlettes. The second one is uses Steam rather than GameStop.
The third is facial hair.
software delivery system.
Exactly, one of us has a full beard right now, so that's the person who said that facial hair counts for Ubermenschery.
The other one on the couch has some sweet sideburns,
Mutton chops.
Got the chops going.
where the other half are...
Clean shaven.
Baby-faced. Well, we've got one clean-shaven, one baby-faced.
Okay.
Yeah. I look like
Womp womp.
I look like a child. I got carded for a rated R movie last year.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Wow.
I'm 27.
Dude, I
Hold on to that one.
I don't know theaters that card people unless they're literally children. They're
I think
you look like you're 14, but whatever.
I was carded at 18.
maybe they were just being funny,
18.
but I haven't been carded since I was like a child,
Yeah,
like
you
since I
traded.
was
Like,
too young to drive,
it's
right?
not like it's a law.
Well,
If they let someone who's underage into a rated R movie, there are no legal repercussions.
Well, there's the potential repercussion of like getting fired,
Well,
or
yeah,
whatever,
I
right? So
suppose,
there's those repercussions. They're not going to jail, but
Yeah.
And what's the likelihood a manager's going to like look on someone who's serving you and be like, "Oh, you didn't card him"? Yeah.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, maybe that.
I think it's about preventing angry mothers from
Yeah.
yelling at you.
Yeah.
I think, but it's entirely possible. I don't look 10,
No.
so it could be that the person
I don't
behind the
think
counter
so.
was just having fun. I don't know what it was, but it did stick out.
I'm going to go ahead and absolve your concerns. You don't look like you're 10.
Great.
Did it look like that was their first week at the job? Or
I honestly don't remember. I just remember I remember looking at my ID and I'm like, seriously? How do you think I got here? Like there's two of us. You think that whatever? It was just a thing.
She's not my babysitter.
Right.
Uncognition on Reddit just a few hours ago says, regarding our EA episode, you got at least one person, me, to finally take the Giving What We Can pledge after much needless procrastination. Yay!
Nice.
Sweet. Good job.
Sam
you
Harris
two.
did that for me.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Well, fuck yeah, that's awesome. So that's exactly what I was talking about on the show. Was that on the one hand, there's this societal norm where soliciting your gift giving and how charitable you are is seen as like dickish somehow, but if you post every time you send a donation, you post the receipt to Facebook and text it to your entire family or something. But I think there's a fine line to walk between, like, I guess being in everyone's face and about it all the time and just kind of doing it super quietly, never telling anyone unless they ask or whatever. But the idea is that, if you can break the taboo about talking about it and get more people, engaged, again, we've got one more person doing it, even like a day, right? That literally adds up to a percentage of a life saved, or possibly an actual person who's not dead, right?
Yeah.
So
there's Patrick Rothfuss had like a world building stream he did once, and he started talking about Heifer International, and he made a really good case. He went into detail about what they do and everything, and I thought it was so cool that I was like, okay, I'm gonna give him some of my money. I forked over some money, and it was.
I gave $100 to Tossdam after reading Ozzy's blog post on Thing of Things about how it helps prevent female mutilation, and it seemed pretty effective. Uncloggin also says, late in the episode, you brought up money priming. The finding that subtle reminders about money can prompt people to become more selfish and not donate as much to charity. One of you, that would be me, asked about replication. In fact, this effect has not replicated in well-powered studies.
Good.
They then provide several links, 2 links specifically that demonstrate and discuss this repeated failure to replicate. The reason I ask nowadays about replication for social study, for social research, is because there have been at least a few people who've said we should start considering the year 2016 year 0 for social research, and anything that happened before year 2016, ask, did it replicate? Because there were so many things in social research that someone managed to find an effect once and published it like crazy and blew it all out of proportion, and no one bothered to replicate. And now that people have started trying to go back and replicating, they just don't replicate. One of my favorite ones was the finding that if you give someone a warm cup of coffee to hold in their hands, they become warmer emotionally to the people they're talking to. Whereas if you give them a cold drink to hold in their hands, they become more distant and cold. I really liked that one, and I repeated it several times, and then it turned out several years later they tried it again, and it did not replicate.
Sounds like something Socrates came up with.
And it does, doesn't it?
Well, it also seems
the thing is, there was actual research to support this, data and everything. It's just that it was one of those, data mining, we managed to find an effect by coincidence, and it is this huge thing that we make a big deal out of. That is why everything needs to be replicated, and anything that hasn't been replicated, I always take with a huge grain of salt and always ask, has it been replicated?
That's a really important point. I'm glad that they brought up that this hadn't been replicated. And I didn't actually read the primary research on this. I had heard it repeated by lots of smart people. And the fact that they all took it and ran with it, I assumed that there was something to this.
Right.
I think smart people like, I think, Will McCaskill and Peter Singer, and I can't guarantee that it was either of those, but definitely, in the philosophy literature about effective altruism.
There's been at least a couple studies that Eliezer cites in the sequences. somewhat strongly in one case, which did not replicate in more recently.
Did the comments point that out?
No, because I don't think that was a thing at the time in 2007. People weren't really thinking about that. It's been more something that's come up more recently, and so I also have been very often in the past repeating things which it turned out later did not replicate, and that is why nowadays I kind of have this aversion and always ask, did it replicate?
Well, shit,
because I feel really bad about the things that I spread in the past.
I think scope neglect is replicated among enough things, because now I'm thinking of the one that I brought up tonight about that girl and the brother and family. That's the one specific one I can think of, but there's also the one you mentioned the seagulls, but this was that one in Canada where it was some other oil spill some decades ago or something.
Mm-hmm. Scope neglect has been replicated quite a few times.
Fair enough, but any individual study I'll be more careful about, and that is a good lesson for me to be more guarded about what I take for granted from hearing smart people say. I'll be more careful. Yeah. That's kind of a bummer, because now it's going to put all this extra research on me.
Right.
I'd like to be able to shoulder all off onto them, but oh well.
Hopefully that won't be as much of an issue going on, since people do consider that now, and everyone is aware about it, but still good to be careful.
Well, and I mean, like, a lot of these things, too, especially with social science, like, 40 college kids from Yale had this happen, therefore it's true of all humans on Earth. That's sort of, I think, been a recognized failure but I mean, it just happens to be that, a lot of psychologists work at schools, populations that have to participate go to the school, and you don't have to pay them, so they're really easy targets for study. So, it makes sense that a lot of stuff is done to them, but to then generalize it is I think, to be careful. But I just hear somebody talking fairly seriously about a study that involved either 10 people or 2 groups of 10. And they were talking about it like it was this discovery. And I need to find this. I don't know if I could dig it back up, but it was just in the last couple of days. And I was wondering the entire time, like, this was 20 people.
Yeah. Your sample size is too small.
And why? This was somebody smart. It's driving me insane now that I can't think of where to place this, but this did happen. So, yeah. Beware your sample sizes and failure to reproduce.
So where do you draw the line between being gullible and repeating everything you hear and being so skeptical you have to fact check every single thing that you hear?
My typical, it depends. Like, I realized when you mentioned, like, being gullible on the internet and stuff, I never really had a problem with that. I think maybe I was introduced to skepticism shortly after the advent of internet in my house. So I lucked out there that in my early teens I was already kind of calling bullshit on everything, which is a great way to kind of sometimes be right more often. I guess it's a way to not be gullible, but it's also a way to, like, be a conspiracy theorist. So
be contrarian.
Yeah, but
well, if you say something so contrarian that you get a response from a bunch of people who give arguments that you yourself find believable, then you've done something to fact check yourself.
Right. I guess it's not like so much of a line as it is a process. One of it would be investigate when I can, be confident in the expertise of the person I'm listening to. If they're not an expert on it, or if they have a reputation for being outside their consensus of their field, take them with skepticism, make predictions, ask people, put it on public forums, or even if it's just Facebook, and say, anyone hear about this or whatever. So, there's ways to do it. It's not so much just about what my filter process is. It's also about, like, my process after the fact. But, like, as far as things that get buried, like, I don't remember where I first heard about that study with the girl and their brother and the family, right? So if that's not true, I've heard it either so many times or from the first place that I've never bothered to look it up again. Any more feedback?
I have 2 on the punching Nazis.
All right, real quick.
Okay. The Mike, and it is the Mike, says, there is a false equivalence between the German Nazis of the 40s and the Nazis we have around today.
Absolutely.
Using the actions of our grandparents in this case as a moral center is inappropriate and hypocritical. The German Nazis were a group of people who were in control of a country, had an army, and more importantly were committing acts of violence against many people, whereas today's Nazis are a group of morons who yearn for the old days. Despite the neo-Nazis being violent, they do not have an army, nor hold office, nor influence law.
I thought we kind of acknowledged that they weren't exactly equivalent. We just kind of referenced them in a very limited fashion.
And then you pointed out there's like 200 of them.
Yeah,
or they're sharing ideology.
Like Richard Spencer has the power to what he can rent out a hotel conference room like a couple times a year. Like,
I didn't know this when we recorded the episode. I found out more recently that he runs his think tank, the National Policy Institute, that everyone keeps mentioning that, oh my god, he's running this think tank that tries to affect policy. He runs that out of his apartment.
So, these numbers might be a little bigger than the 200. They can fill a room of 200, but someone wrote in a really good comment, and we talked about in the last episode that hasn't aired yet, these numbers might be considerably higher, but as far as people who are ready to travel...
considerably?
Somewhere maybe north of the tens or possibly hundreds of thousands.
Unlikely to be hundreds, I don't think, but probably tens of thousands.
And I think the number of these, it depends on idiots. I just picture some 15-year-old with an unshaven child mustache sharing frog memes, right? That's
Hey, don't bring frog memes into this. They did nothing wrong.
They
So
were co-opted.
I mean, I think that probably counts for some of these people, but and then there's also like they don't hold office, they don't have an army. There's the concern some of these people that people call Nazi-esque are definitely in high office currently in the United States, and so that is why there's some people that are being raising alarms about this.
I still feel it's really weird to call Richard Spencer a Nazi. He's not part of the Nazi Party, and as he says, a lot of neo-Nazis hate him, and I kind of think that's legit.
He's a white nationalist.
He's definitely a white nationalist, yes.
Right. And yeah, like people are just kind of...
Nazi's shorthand for that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well,
but
yeah,
I don't think it should be.
it's yeah,
I think
maybe
there's more to Nazism than just being a white nationalist.
Well, I think
white nationalism is definitely a important part of it, but I think Nazism goes beyond just that.
well, and people
I would agree. I'm just saying people use that as shorthand.
Definitely from historical context, absolutely it would.
And people, I think, love using that word because anyone that they can brand a Nazi is therefore subhuman and
It's a way of othering.
defensible.
It's a way of othering.
Absolutely, it's a way of othering to a level. I think we talked about this. Was it on that episode where like they're subhuman once they're Nazis?
Yep.
They're not just.
We did.
They're not other groups. They're non-people, right? So then it's no matter what happens to them, it's okay. So it's very politically advantageous to you to label your enemies Nazis because then if you can get people to agree, then they agree that your enemies don't matter. But that doesn't make it accurate, right?
Yeah. Albionic American says, people keep missing the alt-right's real message, and by now I think this has to happen because of perverse blindness.
Oh, I remember this comment.
Yeah. And the alt-right's racism doesn't really upset people, but rather its rediscovery of our ancestors' tragic view of man. Social progress can't happen because man has an obdurate nature. I don't know if that's how you pronounce that word.
Obdurate.
Okay.
What is the meaning of the word obdurate?
Is it
You are-
air?
Stubbornly refusing to change one's opinion or course of action. So, stubbornness.
Okay, so stubborn, alright. Yeah.
Because man has an obdurate nature that you can't reshape like clay into the arbitrary configurations demanded by the political correctness of the current year, in caps. We have inequity, hierarchy, and patriarchy because of this reality. We have to construct the best lives we can under these constraints.
Ooh,
Not long ago, our ancestors would have called this realistic view of human condition something like wisdom. Compared with our elite's childish utopianism which denies this reality, the alt-right people sound more like the mature adults in the country these days.
yeah. So my dad actually told me about this book called A Conflict of Visions, written by Thomas Sowell. I'm probably saying his name wrong. I think it's like Soul or Sowell, but it's Sowell. And in the book, he posits that there are these philosophical differences between they're called visions, but basically one of the visions is called the constrained vision, in which the idea is that man is not perfectible morally. It's like mankind, humankind, tend to be selfish and self-centered and just smart enough to think that they can rise above their station, but they ultimately can't. Thus, we must rely on things like traditional, like religion and stuff like laws and like to kind of keep people in check, because otherwise they'll run rampant and kind of do bad things. And then the other side is this unconstrained vision, which is basically like man is morally perfectible. I'm abbreviating massively here, and like we can become enlightened, we can overcome our nature, we can overcome our impulses and use our rational big brains to like improve our lives. And that eventually we're going to delegate those kinds of these high level decisions to experts who can kind of kick down what's best for everyone.
Isn't that literally the Enlightenment?
Yeah, it's like people like I would almost say that like the rationality community I would assume is largely unconstrained, very much like yes, mankind can improve itself, it can elevate itself, but the constrained vision is very much like in despair of humanity in terms of their ability to be altruistic and good. They kind of think that people are inherently not great. Yeah. People are people.
That's literally what he just said.
Yeah, it just reminded me so much of that.
Because people are shitty.
Yeah, it reminded me so much of that. Yeah. Like, and I haven't read the book. I've watched summaries on it, but that's kind of what came to mind. I thought that was kind of interesting.
I think that is a fascinating difference of opinion. Like, I didn't even know that this was something people thought.
Yeah.
Until just recently. Like, when he says because of perverse blindness, I dispute that, because I don't think I am being, perversely blinding myself. I simply had no idea that there were people who thought that that people are so shitty that we can't make progress.
It's maybe it's not even like, oh, people are so shitty, they're awful, they're garbage. It's more like there are limits, right? There are limitations to how much we can. I don't know. It's a perspective. I don't think I entirely agree with it. It's just it's like I definitely would consider myself more unconstrained in this case, but those could, like, in and of itself could be a kind of a false dichotomy of visions. It's supposed to be kind of a spectrum, but you're supposed to fall on one or the other.
The worldview that he laid out, and it's you gave out a charitable version where there's like this spectrum, but the one that the write-in gave, like, that seems to me to be factually incorrect. If this is the result of perverse blindness, it's not perverse, it's just incidental blindness, but I really don't think it is. There has been progress over the last centuries that either you're saying isn't there is bad because it goes against the state of nature, or just because it's unsustainable because it goes against the state of nature. But it's not, I think, written into the stars or written into our genomes that one race would dominate another. It happened to be an accident of history that some had technology faster than others and were able to subjugate, and other factors, obviously. But was that your interpretation of that as well? That it seems to deny the fact that progress has happened?
Yeah, well, I basically agree with you that I do think progress has happened. That we don't, for the most part, we don't torture people anymore. We don't have slavery. We don't burn kittens for entertainment. But I guess it also kind of depends on your point of view. Like, there's a number of people who would say that we have regressed and things were better before the Enlightenment. I've literally read arguments where people saying the reason people call it the Enlightenment is because they are perverse and they're trying to hold on to their own power and they're profiting off this world even though this world is worse. So they're trying to paint it as this wonderful thing. We're like, oh, the Enlightenment saved us, when in reality, the Enlightenment has brought mankind down into hedonism and purposeless existence and has just made life worse in general for everyone on the planet.
That sounds like a different demographic of people than the one that person is describing.
I mean,
so that is not the alt-right position.
No,
that hedonism. Yeah. Right. So if that's the case, fine. Those people are welcome to unplug and go scratch in the dirt like our ancestors, right? No, I'm serious.
Jeez, well,
like, I hope you won't. I want everyone to be happy. But like, if that's really your position, cool. Try it for a week.
I think
go outside without clothes, or bring or wear whatever you can catch, right? Like that's some bullshit.
I think they want to keep the technological progress, but it's the social quote unquote progress that they disagree with and say has been social regress rather than progress.
Like they want to go to more like tribal society kind of progress. Like what model do they think is?
I don't think that, if I had to guess, I would say that the alt-right community, so far as it exists as a community, is probably too diverse to say that this is what we're support, right? Just like the progressive community probably has different ideas of what progress means. You know, some of us, when they talked about reshaping men to be better or something, whatever the phrasing was in the write-in, some of us wanted to do that literally with brain augmentation with computers, and others want to do it with drugs or with thoughtful contemplation or whatever, right? So
being intellectual.
Yeah, so like there are different avenues to go about making people better. So the saying that all people who are progressive want to make people better isn't like a unified statement, insofar as like there are a lot of people want to go about that differently.
I think what his intention is that by trying to live in this ideal world where humans are perfect and not respecting the fact that we are constrained by various biological impulses, we make things worse. That if we were to accept the fact that people are naturally a little bit racist and a little bit sexist, then we could work within those limitations to forge a better system than one that ignores that and pretends that it's not an issue.
Oh, I think we do that, and that's what we're doing.
Sense, like the way you just presented, like that, or like that makes sense. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm saying the way you presented it makes sense as far as what they're saying. Sorry.
You're welcome to bask in the light of a Steelman argument. But that's not the world we live in, right? We live in a world where people are aware of our implicit bias, and we make efforts to correct for them. We talked a long time ago about getting more female musicians by just not looking at who's playing the music. So like people are aware, hey, you know what? There's no reason for us to select against women. Yeah. Because for some reason we keep doing it, let's just make it so we can't. And then we'll just pick the best players. We are acknowledging this failure and correcting for it. Not just acknowledging it and running with it.
And it feels like a cop-out to just be like, this is how humans are, so we should just deal with it. We should just allow that to be the case and not challenge the status quo, which it kind of feels like that's what that's saying.
I think the counter-argument would be that the progressive social left believes that all humans are intrinsically equal, more or less, and they see that the population is, let's say, 2/3 white, 1/3 minority. And so they say, well, since that is the composition of the population, there's no reason that that shouldn't be the composition at every workforce. And so they pass laws that say, if you have a college, 2/3 of your students are allowed to be white, 1/3 have to be minority. If you are a large employer, 2/3 of your employees can be white, 1/3 have to be a minority. And I think he's saying that that ends up having more bad effects than it fixes. Because by ignoring the other factors, the fact that people are somewhat racist and tribal, and simply forcing everyone to have exactly the distribution that we see in the population without taking into account things like racism or tribalism, or just the fact that maybe people are less able to speak the language and that makes a difference in certain professions, that it's making the situation worse rather than better to ignore that.
So you made another really good steelman, but I think you're being, and so we're talking about a completely different argument now. I'm going to just put that out there, that you've steelmanned it to the point where it's unrecognizable as this original position. That was much more coherent than the one that was given. If they had said, for example, I feel like there are some failures with our current implementations of affirmative action, that would have been a much more defensible, not necessarily a position I'd agree with, but a much more solid defensible position. Mm-hmm. But they flat out said progress is like impossible or something.
Right, right. Like if they have a criticism of affirmative action, then it's like, okay, well, let's improve it, right? Mm-hmm. Not, oh, well, then throw the whole thing out because it's garbage.
So are they saying that humans without rules, whether it's religion or law, cannot progress and get better?
Oh, I don't...
Was that the argument?
I don't think that's what it is. I think it's...
I took it... I don't want to be uncharitable, but I took it more or less as trolling. I didn't even really think that there was a whole lot of content to that statement that was... Again, if I'm being... What was the person's name who wrote in?
Albionic American?
If you want to write in and clarify, I'm receptive. I'm not trying to be a dick, but whatever point you're trying to make did not shine through in what you wrote. At least not to me. And maybe it is blindness, but it's certainly not me being intentional, or what was the word they used? Perverse. It's just me not being able to see where you're coming from. But if you want to come about it a different way, we can have a real conversation. But I took it as more or less trolling.
The thing that struck me that made me interested in the comment is when he said, you can't force people into the arbitrary configurations demanded by the political correctness of the year. Which sometimes... You feel that a little bit, right?
You can't force them immediately. So there's a difference between we can't force people into these configurations based on what you think you should be doing and just self-examination, right? Like being like, hey, maybe this thing we're doing is kind of a problem. Maybe this thing we're doing isn't great. We should try to improve upon it. And those things happen gradually. It's not like we need to force humans to go completely against their natures and it's this strenuous thing and it's going to cause all kinds of agony. I don't know that I like that. I don't necessarily even think that that's the argument. There's kind of an area. It feels like it kind of sits in that kind of idea space, I guess. But that sounds like somewhat of a legitimate philosophical view of the world to take. But I did think the way that you presented it was pretty concise overall. I mean, I think it's one way of putting it.
Or at least engageable.
Yeah. It's kind of a pessimistic view of humanity. Like, people are going to be kind of stuck in their ways and like people are they're intransigent. They're just not, they're not that malleable. So you might as well just shape society to that tendency rather than to change society to fit these high concepts. Hmm. I don't agree with that, but I understand kind of what they're trying to say.
I think optimism and pessimism make a big difference in like someone's day-to-day life. I much prefer being optimistic than pessimistic, but I think if we're trying to look at something from a rationalist perspective where we actually look at society, one shouldn't ask, is this pessimistic or optimistic? One should say, is this real? Is it reflected by the data and the world? And if the pessimistic view is the more accurate one, then you should go with the pessimistic one.
Sure.
Well, it looks like we're kind of tired. Do we want to wrap it up for the night?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you all in 2 weeks. Bye.
Bye.
Cheers, everyone.
Later.